Well, hi everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Flicks the Church Forgot. This is the second part in an episode looking at the subject of Halloween. So if you'd like a review of a seasonal film, then do check out part one of this episode, which explores the underrated 1982 horror film Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, which was also known as the film that no one takes home, because not many people liked it, but I did. But in this episode, we're going to be taking a closer look at the subject of Halloween and trying to explore the religious implications of what appears to be a rather dark and morbid time of the year. And I actually have a fair amount of stuff to say about this subject this evening, and so rather than create a very long podcast, and I know that some people really like long ones, but I do quite like the ones that are split up, and so you can have it in sort of bite-sized chunks, and that's what I'm going to do with this. It means that I'm going to split this into 2, possibly 3 sections, so you're not overwhelmed with information. And so tonight we're going to look at the history of Halloween. Then we're going to turn our attention to the sort of contemporary Christian response to Halloween, which is usually negative. And then I'm going to be suggesting some ways that we can view Halloween in a more positive light, and that actually it might not be as dangerous and scary as people might have us believe. And so we're going to be looking at tonight the history of Halloween and where it all comes from. I actually come to you now at the moment speaking from my cupboard. Yes, I'm sort of in a cupboard. Let me explain. That sounds very odd. I'm trying to find better acoustics in my house so that you don't get too much echo or reverberation with my voice. And so I've been searching around my house, and I discovered that the cupboard under the stairs, which I can fit into quite fine, it's not echoing very much. So I'm trying to do that. But I'm currently in this under the stairs closet. I feel a bit like Carrie White coming into her prayer cupboard, and so it's a little bit odd and spooky. And I'm hoping my wife doesn't come back and discover me in there. She's going to think I've seriously lost it. But anyway, we'll try that out and see if this sounds okay to you. But let's get started.
Part 1. Season's Greetings.
If you walk between the vegetable aisle and the children's toys, just a few steps from the magazines, in my local Sainsbury's supermarket, you'll find an aisle that crops up once a year. And it seems to be getting more and more shelf space as each 12 months goes by. And it's here you'll find the sort of stuff that is never normally on anybody's shopping lists. Werewolf masks, glow-in-the-dark fingers to stick on and extend your own hand into a witch's hand, splayed out fangs in a plastic blister pack. Yes, you know the time has arrived, it's Halloween. And these days, the shops in the UK seem to take it much more seriously than they used to. I mean, I remember when I was a kid that you were lucky if the local newsagent would have a few plastic masks just of the face, you know, of a witch or a skull hanging off a flimsy bit of white elastic. But these days, you can buy the full-on rubber overhead mask, not quite silver shamrock quality, but, you know, which is quite a relief, honestly. But, you know, they're really good. And the masks, I remember these sorts of werewolf masks and stuff used to cost about 50 quid. When I was little, I wanted to save up and get one from Blackpool, which is a seaside resort in Britain. And they were the only places I knew of that sold these sorts of things, but it was way too expensive. And yet now, for $5.99 in the supermarket, you can buy them. They look great. So what happened? Since when did Halloween become so popular? Well, of course, if you're listening to me from America, this is nothing new for you. Because from what I gather, American culture has celebrated Halloween in a much more extravagant and consistent way than we have in Britain. And actually, maybe it's your influence through films and TV which helps explain why we're getting more into it in this country. Just in the same way as the UK are now getting into high school proms. We actually have a high school prom culture going on now, which we never had until American pop culture sort of turned us onto it. So Halloween is certainly here, but what exactly is behind it? What's its origins? What is its purpose? And how does it fit in to the whole world of religion? Or does it even fit in at all? Well, judging by some Christian reactions to Halloween, it is literally the low point of the spiritual year. It's the time when darkness is celebrated instead of light. and something that should be shunned. I'm a Christian, so shouldn't I follow that same advice? Should I make sure I avoid the Halloween aisle when I'm out next shopping for my milk and Weetabix? Well, I'm not so sure. We're going to explore those questions tonight, and by doing that we need to go firstly back to the beginning.
Part 2. The origins of Halloween.
Just to state the obvious, Halloween is a festival that's celebrated on the 31st of October, and the timing of it is actually quite important because it's associated with the old Celtic celebrations of the end of summer. And it's actually the echo of a pagan festival that was celebrated by the Irish and the Scots called Samhain. Now, what exactly is Samhain? Well, you might recognize it more being pronounced like Samhain, because it's spelled S-A-M-H-A-I-N, but actually it's more correct to pronounce it Samhain. So what is it? Well, in modern paganism and witchcraft, you get 8 seasonal festivals that happen throughout the year. 4 of them are minor festivals and 4 of them are major, and they call them Sabbats. Now, Samhain is one of the big ones, and historically the Sabbats were seen as times where witches would take part in devil worship and make pacts with Satan and all that sort of stuff. Pretty busy weekend, really. Now, some people say this sort of idea was exaggerated and even made up by the witch finders of the time, and to be fair, they did have a tendency to exaggerate. So we don't know how much of this is really real. I don't know enough about it. But anyway, Samhain was one of these Sabbats, and it occurred on November the 1st in the Roman calendar, I think. And the word comes from the Irish and Scottish Gaelic word, which means the end of summer. And so the time of Samhain was in many ways a sort of turning point festival, where the final harvest was brought in. You know, the older season goes away, the summer disappears, and then the colder season starts. And in the ancient Celtic calendar, it actually did mark the start of a new year. Now, Halloween, as we know it, has its roots in this Samhain festival. I mean, when you think about the end of summer and the beginning of autumn and winter, you don't have to be an angst-ridden emo goth, right, to realize that in a sense it is filled with a sense of death. I mean, I don't want to get all pessimistic about it, but spring and summer, I mean, it's different, isn't it? It sees new life and flowers and plants growing, and people are skipping through meadows with birds on their shoulders. Well, maybe not, but you know, you get the picture. Spring and summer, they're vibrant. There's a buzz in the air, normally a wasp, and the natural world seems to be firing on all cylinders. You know, it's the time of positivity. It's a time of happiness. If you've got seasonal affective disorder, you know what I mean. But then as the summer ends and the cold weather creeps in, you see the leaves go brown and they curl and they die, and the wasps and the bees of summer seem to nick off somewhere. I don't know where they go. Not that I'm complaining. They can stay there if they like. And farmers can't grow their crops like they did, and the skies grow dark and things get cloudy and stuff starts to die. So there is a logic and there's a good reasoning why people would start to associate this time of year with the subject of death. And so all throughout Europe there were celebrations and festivals like Samhain at this time of year, and the pagan festivals ended up being adopted by the Christians as the Christians grew in influence. And they came up with instead All Saints' Day and All Hallows and All Hallows Eve, which is where we get Halloween from. And so for Christians, they may have had these new festivals and dressed it up and Christianized it, but this time of year still saw the crops dying, and the cold would still creep in, and so there was still a vibe of death around this time of year. Just because you're a Christian, you don't get plucked out of that. And so already, when you have this idea of death going on at Halloween, it becomes a mysterious and dark time. However, it also is spooky because the ancient Celts thought that this time of the year was what they might describe as a thin place. By that I mean a place and time where the barrier between the physical and the spiritual world was at its most flimsy. So good and bad spiritual forces could cross over into this world. And pretty soon you have a time of year that is defined by death and supernatural possibilities. Because both the good and the bad spirits might come through at this thin time. You know, people would either welcome in kindly dead relatives who popped in to say hi from beyond the grave, or at the same time they would actively try to scare away potential bad spirits coming through this thin place. And so people started to do things to protect themselves, wearing costumes and masks to ward off the evil spirits. And so what do you have? You've got death, the supernatural, masks and costumes, voila, we get the essential elements of Halloween as we know it today. Now, other classic Halloween icons, they came a bit later. For example, things like pumpkins and jack-o'-lanterns. They're actually more of an American development. But the idea for pumpkins, if you're interested, and for jack-o'-lanterns was inspired by British and Irish people, and they used to carve faces into root vegetables around this time of year. Yeah, well, they didn't have Nintendo back then, so they had to find something to do. But actually, this was used to scare off these evil spirits. And turnips, funnily enough, were used quite a lot by the Celts, which I find personally quite interesting. Let me explain before you think I'm weird. And that's because when I was a kid growing up in the 1980s in the northeast of England, at Halloween, everyone always used to have a turnip and not a pumpkin. And I used to think it was just really lame, and it was like a poor man's pumpkin, and when were we going to do it properly like the Americans do it and get some proper pumpkins? But actually it turns out, after all, turnips were the most authentic. They just don't look very cool. So Halloween itself certainly has religious origins. Even trick-or-treating, right, is quite similar to a medieval practice called souling. And that's where on November the 1st, poor people would go around houses offering prayers for the dead in return for food. And so as Halloween developed, it brought about all sorts of games and customs, like bobbing for apples, for example. But lots of the Halloween games, when you look at them, have a sort of divination purpose. For example, I saw a greetings card from 1904 which encourages women to indulge in this common custom, a Halloween custom at the time. And that was to hold a candle and stare into the mirror on Halloween night. And over their shoulder they would see materializing the face of their future husband. But if they were to die before they were married, they would see the face of a skull. Ooh. You can imagine how tense it would have been to do this if you were a woman back then. It's a pretty grim thought for a greetings card as well, you must admit. And I'm also not sure what the explanation would be if you don't see any face over your shoulder, which surely was the case for most people who tried this little technique. Maybe that meant you wouldn't get married, but at least you wouldn't die for a while. I don't know. But anyway, Halloween grew into this cultural event that we all know today. Although maybe not all of us, not across the world. Halloween is actually not in all cultures. It's found mainly in Western cultures, especially where there's a British or Irish influence. So while there are certainly religious aspects to Halloween, if we were to turn our attention to more contemporary Christian attitudes towards it, we don't tend to find many open arms to the witching season, as it were. This isn't the case over all the church. I mean, I've read of some Christians being willing to celebrate the occasion. But in reality, I've never actually experienced this. I've never met anyone like this. It's only recently that I got in touch with somebody through the internet who was also a Christian and also was interested in Halloween and enjoyed Halloween and actually had some sort of Christian defense for it. That's a guy called Lynn Thatcher. I'll mention more of him later. But everyone else I've met in the church think it's something that Christians ought not to get involved with. Some people are very anti-Halloween, while others just haven't really thought about it and just assume that it's not appropriate for a Christian to be involved with. Now, why would Christians get so touchy about this subject? Well, it's this question to which we'll turn to in the next episode of this Flicks the Church Forgot Explores Halloween.